Good afternoon, everybody. Shana Tova to those who celebrated Rosh Hashanah this week. We're just waiting for people to come on to the Zoom. We're going to wait another couple seconds, and then we'll get started. Okay. All right. Well, welcome to our webinar, 20 years since Durban, How the UN Conference Against Racism Fuels Antisemitism Today. This webinar is sponsored by the Rose Project of Jewish Federation of Orange County. I'm Lisa Armony. I'm the Chief Impact Officer at Jewish Federation and Director of the Rose Project. For more than 50 years, Jewish Federation has been strengthening Jewish life in Orange County, in Israel, and around the world through philanthropy, programming, and critical social services. The Rose Project provides a local platform for education on issues of concern to our community, including Israel, anti-Semitism, and delegitimization, as well as for advocacy and leadership development. Over the past year, we've presented a variety of webinars on recent issues in Israel and on current manifestations of anti-Semitism. Recordings of these webinars are located on our website, and we encourage you to take a look at your convenience. Today's webinar is also being recorded and will be available on the site in the coming days. Before we get started, I'll just go over a couple of housekeeping items so you'll know how to participate in today's event. At any time during the webinar, you can submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom control panel on your computer. And thank you to those who submitted questions with your registration. I've incorporated some of your questions already into the discussion. And after the formal presentation, we'll direct as many of your questions to our speakers as time allows. It's really an honor to have two truly outstanding experts with us today, with whom we're going to unpack and explore the ramifications of the 2001 United Nations Conference Against Racism, or the WCAR, as it's known. We're going to look at the ramifications on anti-Semitism today, and particularly the challenge posed by the extreme left of the political spectrum. Challenges that I know some of you on this webinar are being confronted by. And so we hope that today's webinar will provide a helpful framework and language for you, as well as some tools that will help you navigate this very difficult arena. Our conversation today is taking place 20 years to the month of the first WCAR, World Conference Against Racism, in Durban, South Africa. The conference was ostensibly held to mark the end of the apartheid regime in South Africa and to adopt an ambitious global plan of action to end racism, xenophobia, and discrimination worldwide. As we know, it turned out to be something else altogether. Comprised of a governmental forum and a parallel forum for NGOs, or non-governmental organizations, the agenda was hijacked and derailed by another agenda that filled with hate that targeted Israel and Jews. Despite serious issues of racism and discrimination around the world, Israel alone was singled out and made a pariah. In an era and at a conference seemingly committed to human rights, Israel was accused of the worst violations of human rights: apartheid, ethnic cleansing, genocide, and crimes against humanity. Zionism, the Jewish people's ideology and movement for national self-determination, was declared once again in a UN forum to be racist, all in an attempt to delegitimize the moral argument for Israel's existence. In fact, the NGO Declaration and Program of Action adopted by a majority of NGOs branded Israel a racist apartheid state guilty of genocide and called for an end to its racist crimes against Palestinians. To explore what happened in Durban and its impact today, I'm happy to introduce our two panelists. Their biographies and accomplishments are very extensive, and I invite you to take a look at them. They are on the webinar registration page, the page that you use to register for this webinar. But I want to note a couple of important highlights. Dr. Karen Mock is an acclaimed human rights advocate and consultant, psychologist, and educator. She's the former executive director of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation and the League for Human Rights of B'nai B'rith Canada. A pioneer and an expert on human rights, discrimination, racism, anti-Semitism, hate crime, and hate group activity, she has written courses and manuals for intercultural and anti-racism training and taken action against hate. Importantly for today's program, she chaired the National Advisory Committee for Canada's lead up to the United Nations World Conference Against Racism, was on the Canadian delegation, and co-chaired the International Jewish Caucus for the WCAR in Durban in 2001. She's currently president of JSpace Canada, a progressive Jewish organization, and remains active in numerous interfaith and social justice organizations, including the Canadian Association of Jews and Muslims, the Canadian Arab Jewish Leadership Dialogue, and Enhancing Social Justice Education Initiative. Our second panelist is Oren Jacobson. He's a civic entrepreneur, organizer, thought leader, policy advisor, and consultant focused on helping communities and organizations build their strength and capacity that's needed to improve people's lives. His civic advocacy spans local to international engagement, and he's emerged as a leader within the Jewish community and in the progressive movement. A short while ago, Oren co-founded Project Shema with the goal of deepening understanding and building bridges between the Jewish community, Jewish leadership, and the progressive movement. And through this work, he's helped Jewish students and lay leaders, board members, and major national organizations navigate difficult conversations surrounding Israel inside the progressive movement. He's also co-founded and now serves as the co-executive director of Men for Choice, an organization that works to activate, educate, and mobilize male allies in the fight for reproductive freedom. And previously, he served as National Chapter Development Director for the New Leaders Council, which he helped grow into the largest leadership development organization in the progressive movement. So you see, that was an abridged version of their biographies. You can see just how impressive our speakers are. So first of all, Karen and Oren, I want to thank you so much for being here. I know it's been a busy week with holiday activities, but I want to thank you for taking the time to be with us today. And Karen, I'm going to start with you, and I'm going to ask you to take us back 20 years ago to the events in Durban. You were not only present in Durban, but you were also very deeply involved in Canada's preparations for the conference, which began several years before. So take us back to those years. Tell us what your expectations were, your hopes for the conference, and what did you actually encounter on the ground when you were there?
Thank you so much, Lisa, for having me. It's just a thrill to be on this webinar with you. I have such fond memories of the years that we worked together, and I'm just thrilled that we've stayed in touch this way in our respective roles. It's hard for me to believe that it's 20 years since Durban. And getting ready for this, of course, it brought back all kinds of memories, a little bit of post-traumatic stress kicked in, I must admit. You're absolutely right. Canada's preparation started a few years before. We were actually the seconder. In the UN, we seconded South Africa's motion that there be a world conference. It actually was the third world conference against racism. And we seconded that motion. So we were very involved and very, very supportive. What was I anticipating? Well, it was called the World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance. That is the official title of the Durban Conference. I, coming from a background of being very involved in anti-racism work, multicultural education, anti-racist education, anti-hate crime, all of these issues were going to be dealt with in the Durban Conference. And in the lead up to it, the PrepComs in Geneva, for example, I was very excited. I even reached out to some of our colleagues in B'nai B'rith and Canadian Jewish Congress. And I must admit, at that time, even my own CEO of B'nai B'rith, I was head of the League for Human Rights of B'nai B'rith at that time. In the United States, you call it the Anti-Defamation League. they said, oh, Karen, racism, that's your thing. So the Jewish organizations were not really that engaged in the lead up to it until the preparatory committee meeting in Tehran. In all of the other preparatory committee meetings before Geneva, this is before Geneva meetings, everyone attended or could send delegates. The Tehran PrepCom, they refused to allow the delegate from the Simon Wiesenthal International Organization to register and Israel. Well, at that point, I rang the alarm bells. And I was so looking forward to Durban and to having a strong allies kind of work go on there with our anti-racism colleagues. At this point, when we could see the writing on the wall and that they were going to try to bring back the Zionism is racism kinds of language, I did what a lot of students do. You know, you get, or volunteers, you'll get these little emails that say, you don't know me, but I live in, and they'll tell, you know, and I want to connect with you. Well, I did that. I did that to all of the Jewish NGOs that had ECOSOC standing, meaning that we could actually go to the conference and be registered delegates. So I reached out to the ADL and to B'nai B'rith International and to Simon Wiesenthal and to Hadassah and to the World Jewish Congress, introduced myself, and I said, I'm going to the PrepCom in Geneva. Do you have delegates going? If so, we need to meet at that PrepCom and form an NGO Jewish caucus, because we discovered that we would not have a voice to be able to present to the government delegation. That the NGO forum was held the week prior to the government forum. The NGO forum ended on the Friday and the government forum started that day. So I arrive in Geneva and find out that people are kind of looking for me because, and the buzz went out, and 7 or 8 of us representing different organizations got together and we formed the International Jewish Caucus in Geneva so that we could make representation to the NGO Declaration and Program of Action. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been able to do that. I also had to appear before the International NGO Committee in Geneva and literally beg for a commission on anti-Semitism. They had commissions on every other ism and every other phobia, but not one on anti-Semitism. And it was through those commissions, they called them, that you could actually submit sections for the NGO Declaration and Program of Action. So what were my expectations? That we would be able to present. When we went to that NGO International Coordinating Meeting in Geneva, I should tell you, I went with Shimon Samuels, who was from France, and he was going to be the Simon Wiesenthal International representative at the NGO Forum. The 2 of us sat as observers of this NGO Planning Committee. And the Palestinian representative stopped the meeting and said, there are government agents of a foreign government observing, and we should ask them to leave. Well, we had to, of course, speak up. We spoke up for ourselves, talked about our organizations, human rights organizations with ECOSOC standing. The chair apologized, but you could literally see the writing on the wall. In fact, the person that did the draft in Geneva of the NGO Declaration, a lawyer from South Africa, sat down with me and tried to convince me that Zionism was racism, and that when their delegation of the NGO forum organizers. It was called Sangoko, the South African NGO Coordinating Committee. They visited Palestine. They did not go to Israel. And when they visited Jordan, they only went to refugee camps. He's convincing me that it is apartheid as a South African in Israel because, Karen, you realize that if you're not Jewish, you are not even allowed to vote in Israel. I said to him, Charles, you are a lawyer. Where did you get that information? He apologized when I gave him all the rules and everything. And this is the kind of climate in the prep comms that we could see coming when we arrived in Durban. Here we were full of hope that we were going with our colleagues from around the world. And of course, our Canadian advisory committee was very multiracial and diverse. When we arrived, we could see the kind of media show that was being put on. When we go to register in August, the youth forum had already started. And this is the sort of thing that greeted us. People posing for the camera. You had the Naturi Carta there. You had organizations from around the world. This poster at the back of the car, when just before the government forum, when Erwin Kotler arrived from Canada, in the middle of the NGO forum, getting ready for the other forum, this is what faced us. And that poster is actually calling for bloodshed and violence against Jews, for the liberation of Jerusalem. Machine guns based upon faith and Islam must be used. At a conference allegedly fighting racism. So what had happened? The pamphlets and the posters that were being distributed right at the registration kiosk was this brochure or pamphlet from the Arab Lawyers Union with the front swastika equated with the Magen David. And inside, vicious, horrible cartoons. This pamphlet, what if I had won the good things and the bad things, says Hitler, being circulated throughout the crowd. And even at the opening ceremonies, the people that were welcoming us, South Africans, were wearing keffiyehs around their necks. The Jewish students, the Wudges, the World Union of Jewish Students came. They had been at the youth forum. The youth forum, there were people that were lobbying and moving into their declaration also to have Zionism is racism. This is the t-shirt that they did, the front and the back of it. And they gave out flowers when they met these people that were shouting these vicious things in the audience or trying to break into our anti-Semitism commission. And some of them, even our negotiators, one of the Canadian negotiators who was Jewish wore this t-shirt under his dress shirt, just for almost like a little extra armor. I'll just have the next slide so that we can summarize the visual aspects. We just chose a few out of the hundreds of pictures. On the right-hand side there, you see we were in the Zulu area and the Zulu warriors are welcoming us. It was so festive. Before the chair with her keffiyeh got up and welcomed everyone. There were 7,000 people in this rugby stadium or football stadium. And I captured a couple of them, but you can see that there were these huge banners and posters that were pro-Palestinian and anti-Israel. The image that you see on the left was the most difficult day I think I have ever spent. I'm not exaggerating when I say in my life. That morning was Friday morning. I had to go to the NGO coordinating committee and again practically beg them not to have the final vote on the NGO declaration and program of action on Shabbat morning. Saturday morning was going to be the final plenary. I asked that it be put after sundown so that people in the Jewish caucus could attend. I don't know if you realize, but when when the Americans and the Israelis a few days later actually walked out of the government forum, the Israeli government, although they can't ask governments or people to do things for them, they didn't, but we were all encouraged, if we were Jewish and on official government delegations, to stay so that we could do what NGOs are supposed to do and lobby and ensure that we did our work, which we continue to do. The NGO Coordinating Committee internationally refused to move the final plenary. And not only did they refuse, so we were very let down, but that very afternoon, there was this demonstration that you can see some images of. They ask, is anti-Zionism racism? Is it anti-Semitic? Well, I know we're going to discuss this later. In this case, it was. Why? When they wanted to make a major protest, a pro-Palestinian march, that's where those Hitler posters were being circulated. These are the kinds of signs that you saw there. They didn't go and hold those posters outside the government building where the UN nation states were meeting to create the Durban government program of action. They marched on force and surrounded the Durban Jewish Club. We could not get in to the Durban Jewish Community Center to get ready for Shabbat and to continue our work together and to find strength from each other. We needed police escorts to get into that club. They surrounded the Jewish club. This was against Jews. And what they did in Durban was they made the Palestinian-Israeli conflict into a racial conflict, which it certainly wasn't. I'll have more to say later, but I think I'm giving you the kind of climate. In the meantime, the headlines that we were seeing in the newspapers worldwide, I've got a few of them in front of me. Durban meeting brought racism to the fore. Rhetoric threatens UN meeting. Racism felt at meeting on racism. And this one, which was the most hurtful kind of experience we had, Jews forced to hide their identity. The Durban Jewish Caucus did its work, and we met with Mary Robinson. I do have to just add one PS. They refused to make religious accommodation in a human rights framework for us on Shabbat morning. But when Fidel Castro's speech went too long at the NGO forum, and when the Spanish translation was not ready on time, it wouldn't be ready till the evening. That was the basis on which they decided that they would make it happen after sundown. So we went, the Jewish Caucus went. The rule in the NGO forum was that each commission And each organization, each group could define its own terminology and its own victimization. Just a few minutes into the NGO final plenary, a group got up and made recommendations to change our definition and our work on anti-Semitism. So the rules applied to everybody except for the Jewish caucus. We were outvoted. I had the flag, I held it up to vote against the amendment. There were very few of our NGO allies that voted with us. And we had no choice but to walk out of that NGO plenary. We did, during the government forum, meet with Mary Robinson, and she reviewed the NGO Declaration and Program of Action. And because they use language like genocide in a way that was not in keeping with UN definitions of genocide or apartheid or ethnic cleansing, Mary Robinson refused to make the NGO Declaration and Program of Action an official document. They did not give it a number, and it meant that it could not be tabled at the government forum as the voice of civil society.
Thank you, Karen, for sharing that. I know that was conjuring up a lot of difficult memories. And I remember, I knew you when you were there, and I remember hearing the stories when you came back, and I know how difficult it is, and I appreciate your sharing that. I want to turn now to Oren. I want to start to unpack some of these issues that we saw come to the fore in Durban and how they manifest now. But before we even do that, I think we need to be very clear on what is anti-Semitism. And I'm not sure that that's at all obvious. I'm not sure it's as obvious as it used to be in the Jewish community, where we seem to be having discussion and debates over definitions of anti-Semitism. And I don't think it's clear at all in the broader community, where the far left has worked very hard to cloak anti-Semitism in the language of human rights and progressivism. So Oren, tell me, what is your definition of anti-Semitism? How does anti-Semitism work? And how has it become embedded in far left ideology?
Yeah, so I actually think in answering this question, we should take one step backwards towards who/what are Jews. We really should start there. And in having this conversation, I want to make sure to set a table and say, let's not focus solely on the disingenuous actors who we know have a specific agenda that they're pushing, but rather ask ourselves why it is that folks who we ostensibly think of as our allies oftentimes fall for some of these frameworks, or why they would accept some of these frameworks. And it actually starts, I think, with a conversation about who and what are the Jews. And to most people, including some folks in our community, right, if I said to you, what does it mean to be a Jew, you might immediately go to the question of religion, to Judaism. And for many people, for most people, frankly, and it's understandable, it's not about a bigotry, it's just what you would see from the outside world looking at our community, people sort of view us as a religious group. And that's, again, it's understandable. In America in particular, we are framed as a largely white or a completely white religious group. And in the context of sort of the modern social justice movement, the moment you become sort of labeled as white and therefore tangential to or benefiting from white supremacy, there's this whole other set of complicating factors that come with it. But at the core, we are being defined or minimized or generalized, or in some cases, I would say erased, into just a religious community. And the truth is that some of us are deeply religious and some of us are completely secular. But all of us are functionally Jews, no matter where you fall on that religious bandwagon, how devoted or not you are to the practices of Judaism. that is a shared religion of a people with a shared language, a shared history, a shared culture. And certainly I think inside of our community, many of us think about ourselves through sort of a national lens, right? That we are a nation, we are a people. And so the reason why starting there is so critical is because if you tell me that the Jews are just a religious group, then anti-Semitism is inherently only a religious bigotry. And if anti-Semitism is only a religious bigotry, then criticism of Israel can only be anti-Semitic if you attack the faith of the people involved. And anti-Zionism, which I'm going to specifically define here as a delegitimization, delegitimization, not people who have a problem with the impact of Zionism, but people who actually believe that Zionism is illegitimate, the state of Israel is illegitimate, that anti-Zionism cannot be anti-Semitic because it is not an objection to our religion. It is a rejection to a political movement or political ideology, and that on its surface could never be anti-Semitic if Jews are just a religious community. So you start with those two problems, and most people don't really know what it means to be a Jew, which automatically means you don't actually know what anti-Semitism is. For me, to keep this simple, we're not going to get into line 17 of IRA versus Nexus or any of that other stuff. Anti-Semitism is anti-Jew, not anti-Judaism. It is hatred or bigotry or prejudice targeted at Jewish people and Jewish institutions based on the accusations, stereotypes, conspiracy theories of what Jews as a people are responsible for. Now, I'm not saying that anti-Semitism never has manifested under religious frameworks, but in the modern context over the last several hundred years, by and large, when Jews are attacked, we are attacked for being Jews. Now, that can be really confusing for people because you look at like the Tree of Life shooting or Poway, both of which are religious symbols, religious buildings, right? But the significance of those buildings was that they provided a container to find Jews. And the manifestos of both of those shooters focus on the actions of the Jewish people in undermining, in these particular cases, the white European race. And so it's really important to sort of ground ourselves in the fact that what anti-Semitism is today is really anti-Jew. Even the word anti-Semitism is a German-based word that we've accepted, which is to be against the Semitic people, right? So even though that word we've adopted, it's against the Semitic people, against the Jews, because they needed something in their pseudo-racial science to disconnect Jews from whiteness, from pure Aryan blood. And so I think those are the first two really critical components. I'll add sort of one additional piece. Anti-Semitism works differently than other forms of racialized bigotry. And this is where it becomes really confusing for people, especially those who start to think about, in particular in the modern sort of emerging social justice movements, think about systemic power and where you are in society, right? If we think about anti-Black racism in America, we can basically say that in the history of this country, from the moment that it's started to today, white has structurally been on top and Black has been at the bottom. And while those lines are converging and it's better to be Black in America today than at any point in our history, functionally speaking, white people in America still have many structural and cultural advantages. Now, if you define Jews as a white religious group, that means we're on top, not on the bottom. If you think about race as a systemic problem, how could a group that is being attacked with a racialized bigotry end up at the top, so to speak? And there's no conception of how a group that is technically at the top in this basic framework could end up at the bottom, right? There's no historical concept for that other than with anti-Semitism. Because the way anti-Semitism works is anti-Semitism is ever present. But if you think about it like a virus, and I hate to use this analogy, it's not my original analogy, I hate to use this analogy. right now, given where we are, but this is really, really important. If you think about it like a virus, right? Viruses can be present in society for extended periods of time, but only pose great risk to society when there is a new mutation or when the society is unhealthy. And so if I took us back to 1921 Europe, using the language of social justice, you would describe Jews in Germany and in France and in Vienna and in the UK, potentially some, not all, as privileged, elevated status in government and the arts and culture and business. 20 years later, we know what happened to us. Too many people treat the Holocaust as if it is an aberration, as opposed to the continuation of a consistent pattern in Jewish history where a new strain popped up and a new surge emerged, and Jews went from a place of relative safety or potentially just second-class citizenry to the very worst positions in society. And so it acts differently, on top of the fact that most people don't actually know what it is, because most people don't actually know who and what we are, although none of those pieces are necessarily based on being disingenuous at all. Those are understandable blind spots for people.
Okay. So I want to take this now to a little bit forward, and I want to share, Karen, when you and I spoke a couple of weeks ago to prepare for the webinar, you said to me that what started in Durban brought us to a tipping point in May of this year. And just to refresh people's memories, right? In May, there was a military conflict between Israel and Hamas and other Palestinian militia in Gaza. And we saw a number of things that made this round of fighting different. I mean, first of all, we saw an unprecedented, really, I mean, the amount of demonization that was taking place on social media was at levels that I don't think we've ever seen before. And with very direct targeting of Jews with this rhetoric. And I know here in our community, many of our young people felt particularly targeted. We heard from teens, we heard from college students in our own community that they were being bullied by peers who were spreading the rhetoric on social media, very often without really understanding or having any kind of firm knowledge of what was happening in the region. But they were really they were buying into the rhetoric and using it to bully. And I think that the other thing that we saw, there were a couple of things. We saw this penetration of this rhetoric into mainstream discourse. And finally, we saw as these attacks were becoming more prevalent and as physical attacks were happening against Jews in different parts of the world, here in Los Angeles, in New York, Boston, and parts of Europe, acts of physical violence that were motivated by the perpetrator sentiments on Israel, we didn't hear a lot of response from our partners in the anti-hate community, certainly not in the beginning. And so I want to turn to the two of you to help us understand what was different, what happened this past May. How did we get to a point where this so-called criticism of Israel has moved so freely with expressions of anti-Semitism, to the point that they're not only are they not being called out, that they're hardly being noticed at all. So that's the first part. And then as a corollary, how do we talk about this situation, the scenario with our partners in the anti-hate and human rights community in a way that will enable them to recognize how this form of anti-Semitism is manifesting in our own communities, including when it's being stirred by other organizations in our community? I know that's quite a bit, but I don't know who wants to take the first stab at that.
Why don't you go first this time, Oren?
All right. Two very complicated questions, but actually what I just laid out to you, if you think about this as like four interlocking problems, why does it go unnoticed? Let me deal with why it goes unnoticed or unchecked. It's four problems, three of which I laid out, a fourth of which I'm going to share. One is that most people don't understand what it means to be a Jew, which means they Number two, they don't understand what anti-Semitism is. Number three, they don't know how it works. And the fourth thing is that in the context of sort of the emerging social justice spaces, allies are trained to elevate and center and consider the voices of those who are least proximate to power structurally. And so if I raise my voice, I walk into the room, and granted, I walk into the room wearing a yarmulke publicly. So I mean, I identify in the world as a Jew. But if I walk into the room, I look like a white man, right? Let's be very clear. And so if I am then calling out potentially, especially if I'm calling out a person of color, let's say as an example, for what I believe to be anti-Semitism, you've got these four interlocking problems at play. They don't know what it means to be a Jew. They don't know what anti-Semitism is. They don't know how it works. And then my voice is less trusted or validated based on the way that we understand our role in these spaces to challenge systemic and structural power and to give deference to those who are furthest from it. That's sort of the why it's going unchecked piece. The how it ended up moving the way that it moved, I think that, Karen, when you jump in 2 seconds, you're going to say, like, this has been going for 2 decades before Durban, then it's been going for 2 decades since Durban, and then it just finally crashed out. And I think there's two pieces. I want to talk about sort of the structural way that we think about that frames these movements that I'm a part of. And that's the idea that systemic power is the most important thing, and that in the modern, in particular the modern Western world, that systemic power has been set up and maintained by white supremacy, colonialism, and patriarchy. I want to very quickly touch on what I mean by white supremacy, because it makes us feel very uncomfortable. I don't just mean people who are neo-Nazis marching through the streets of Charlottesville. I also mean a structure and a system that benefits white people at the expense of non-white people. And I also mean the denial of the role race plays in sort of our domestic structures. So if you start from that basic framework that structural power is the most important thing, that these 3 pillars uphold that power, and then you add onto it the 4 problems that I just mentioned, what you look at it then is a white religious community is claiming a thing which doesn't seem in line with what you understand the thing to be, and therefore it gets treated as if it is power being used to divide communities as opposed to a legitimate complaint. There's one other piece to this puzzle, which is really critical, and I wouldn't be doing myself or us a service unless I said this. We have reached a point at time in which most of the activists responsible for this energy today don't view the occupation as a temporary occupation, but a permanent occupation. And so the continued expansion of settlements, the continued occupation of the Palestinian territories in the West Bank in particular, plus this movement for 40 years building energy with this language, plus the interlocking problems I mentioned, plus the way that these frameworks and the focus on systemic power has been so ingrained into especially the American political movement since President Trump got elected. That creates a terrible cocktail to allow this ripple effect to explode in the way that we've seen, even though none of it is new, as Karen, I'm sure you're going to dive into in more details. And if you disagree with anything I said, Karen, feel free to challenge it.
No, I don't disagree with anything you said. You call it a cocktail. It was the perfect storm, as well. I'm wondering, I've often wondered if 20 years ago, if the internet was as crazy as it is now, and then you add the pandemic, and who's the traditional scapegoat? Yes, we had the anti-Asian racism and people did all kinds of things against that. And then you add them yet more murders of Black people by the police, and you have the Black Lives Matter movement taking off in it very vocally. And then you get the woke generation, of suddenly, people are discovering what this is and learning from Instagram how to be an anti-racist. And then from those same sectors, from those same organizations, seeing a lot of these other sound bites that are conflating Zionism with something else and singling out Jews and accusing Jews of crimes against humanity, the very crimes that the Nazis were tried at Nuremberg for, and being called white supremacists at a time when Jews, of course, have understood for many years that white supremacists don't consider Jews to be white, and let alone that they aren't all white. So this perfect storm of who's going to be the scapegoat. Yes, we had other scapegoats, but people abusing power as victims. It turned the whole thing on its head, because people don't think of themselves as having power when they join the ranks of, quotes, non-Jews. And Jews are a tiny minority in their midst. They don't think when they're a professor in a class that they are abusing their power as a professor in a systemic way by foisting their political agenda when it comes to Israel and Palestine. And when we speak in the anti-racism world of how do you create a safe space, they want to create the safe space for those who they define as victims and don't see when they turn around and victimize Jews. So we do have a wide range, and that perfect storm just took over in May. The sound bites, the hate going back and forth, allies that even wanted to reach out and work over not just since May, but when Black Lives Matter first came on the scene. And I know that people from JSpace Canada, for example, reached out to some of the leadership because we wanted to support in Canada what Black Lives Matter stood for. But because in Canada, some of that young leadership was so anti-Zionist, they wanted to have nothing to do with us, even though we were a human rights-based, progressive Zionist organization. So again, physician, heal thyself. People don't see their own bias, their own singling out. Right now, when they want to invoke the memory of Durban and have commemorations in next week in the UN, Durban is the wrong framework for us to be fighting racism. They start with all of their preambles, recalling the blah, blah, blah in Durban, and no, why should we be recalling? We need to identify and support all kinds of non-discriminatory initiatives. We all have to fight systemic racism and systemic Islamophobia and systemic anti-Asian and anti-Black racism and systemic anti-Semitism. Our training and our work, we've always said we have to put ourselves in the other shoes. In Durban, the only safe place we had was in what we called the intersectionality caucus. Now they've even taken that word and corrupted it. That if you're going to be allies and understand intersectionality, you automatically have to be anti-Israel. The other thing is, I would be one of the first to say not all forms of anti-Zionism are anti-Semitic. But it's my definition of Zionism, it's the Jewish definition of Zionism that we need. People can't just go and make up their definitions of Zionism and then say that's why Zionism is racism. If you define it the way Lisa defined it, the way Oren defines it, the way I define it, then somebody could decide to boycott settlement wines and not be called an anti-Semite because of their principle of wanting a non-violent way to show a protest against a particular policy. Does that mean we support the BDS movement when the movement itself delegitimizes Israel? You see, so these kinds of nuances are completely missing. And it reminds me of those, what was it, one of the Bushes who said, you're either with us or against us. Well, sorry, that's not how this work goes. There are nuances. If anybody ever said, I'm sick and tired of hearing about slavery and you know, people just trying to weaponize racism and silence my freedom of speech, we would have no difficulty calling them racist. But then when colleagues in anti-racism say, why do I have to hear about the Holocaust again? Isn't Holocaust education just being apologists for what the Jews are doing to the Palestinians? And then not seeing that that's anti-Semitic. So we're coming at this from the same kind of anti-racism, anti-oppression ethos, but wanting that ethos in all of its forms to be applied to Jewish oppression as well, not just to their own definitions of what they think a Jew is or what they believe human rights means. Some of the organizations, I saw one of the questioners came in and wondered about some of our ally organizations, not just because I happen to know the questioner personally. Nice to know that people from around the world are watching. But, you know, some of those main wonderful organizations woke up way too late in Durban and sadly went on to exacerbate some of the issues right now. So organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, they were at some of those international steering committee meetings when I had to go and plead. And it wasn't until the actual voting that they realized what was going on and what we had gone through. And some of them came and apologized to us. Adding to the perfect storm didn't help when Human Rights Watch recently issued their report. And they take a definition when most people in the world, when they think of apartheid, think of South African apartheid. And when they start to kind of fiddle with the definition and define apartheid so that Israel itself as a state can be accused of apartheid and therefore crimes against humanity, that is a manipulation that does not serve them and certainly not us well. Could we speak about apartheid-like elements? Was I part of the boycotting of Granny Smith apples and South African wines and all of that? Yes, I was. Did I ever think I'd be in Durban post-apartheid, sitting on a bus, eating a Granny Smith apple? I almost cried when I thought of that. But is there still systemic racism against Blacks in South Africa? Yes. Is there systemic racism in Canada? And do some people say there are apartheid-like elements? Yes. Do some people want to accuse Canada of crimes against humanity because of what happened with Indigenous people? Yes. But is it at a level where Israel is the only state that is singled out by the UN? I'm in human rights work, and differential treatment is discrimination. Discrimination against Jews or against the only Jewish state has a name, and it starts with an A, and it's anti-Semitism. And it doesn't mean that they hate Jews. Doesn't mean if you say racism, it doesn't mean that everybody wears their bed sheets out at night and burns crosses. People understand racism in all its forms. They refuse in many of the anti-racist allied groups that we call them our partners, and we still have them as partners, and we need them as partners, and they need us.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of, let's
Yeah.
not use the Durban framework. Let's use the framework that we're talking about of how we really do build strong allies in this work.
Karen, I want to build on something you just said and then add one more element in this conversation that neither one of us have said yet. So when I talk about anti-Semitism, I talk about blind spots, biases, and bigotry. We all know what the bigotry looks like. The problem really isn't figuring out the bigotry. The problem is the biases and the blind spots.
Exactly.
And anti-Semitism is thousands of years old, right? The variants have been in the DNA of society for so long, right? You can't exist for more than 2,000 years unless you're systemic, unless you're cooked into the culture, into the frameworks, into the fabric, into the DNA of our society. And unfortunately, many of our peers who genuinely think of themselves as people who want to protect all people, including but not limited to the Jews. And if you challenge them, they would tell you that I will stand with you and I will fight with you and fight for you, have blind spots and biases that make it very difficult for them to even see it because they have consumed it. It is in the air that they breathe and the water that they drink. It is in the DNA. And so that's part of what makes this so complicated. Setting aside the problems and the lack of understanding and all those things, anti-Semitism is baked into the cake. And too frequently for Jews, and usually only for Jews in the sort of the modern context, when we elevate the fact that this is systemic, that it is urgent, that it is real, that it's ever present, and that those biases and blind spots play a role, at the very least, in the things that you described, which are the unique singling out of an ununique state for ununique actions. As a Jew, as the son of an Israeli, as the grandson of a Polish survivor of World War II, I want to hold the state of Israel to the highest standard I can, to the standard it's set forth in its declarations. I want it to be unique. But inside of our family, I'm going to be honest that sometimes it fails to meet those standards. And outside in the world, I am going to ask people the question about why it is that we would treat one group of people, one state, uniquely for ununique actions, even if I ceded, and I don't, but even if I ceded every accusation you could label at the state. If Israel is an apartheid state, every single state in the Middle East is guilty of apartheid. If Israel is an ethnic cleanser, if it is a genocidal state, all of its neighbors are guilty of the same things, and let us raise our voices against all of them together and demand the same approaches and the same solutions to all of those crimes. But I think what you're pointing out is the uniqueness, and when I see the uniqueness, what I think about is not necessarily the bigotry, it's the biases and the blind spots that enable people to miss the bigotry when it is present.
Thank you so much. This was such an incredible conversation, just full of really important nuance that I think really gets lost in the discourse, particularly in an environment like the one that we're operating today that is so polarized and so divisive. These nuances that are so important just go missing. That it's very hard for them to be heard. And I think what you've elevated in this conversation this evening has been really critical to our work in this space when we are engaging with our community members, particularly with our non-Jewish community members who I don't think understand the kind of subtle distinctions and definitions that you're both really pointing to. And so I really want to thank you. I want to thank you for spending time with us this evening and for calling these things out and and highlighting them and giving us a platform with which to continue the conversation in our own communities. And I hope that this is really the beginning of more conversations at this level of nuance that we can have together with our community and bring this work to the broader spaces in which we engage. So Karen and Oren, thank you so much. It's just been such an important conversation. I can see from some of the questions in the Q&A, just some of them were really just comments about thank you for the framing that you've provided and for really enlightening us with your experience and with your practice. So with that, we're going to
thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Lisa. One of the things I've loved about this was working with you and meeting Oren. It's so wonderful when we have allies within our own community. One of the things that Rabbi Melchior said, who headed the Israeli delegation because he was foreign minister during Durban, he said, one of the miracles of Durban was the creation of an international Jewish caucus, because he said usually many of the organizations within our community are fighting against each other. And this time we worked together. So I'm also hoping that even with some, Oren, you alluded to this, that, we do have to have the internal conversations, because so often some of the nuanced work that is so important in building allies outside the community sometimes get undermined by the divisiveness within our own community. So I'm hoping we'll be able to have more and more of these conversations and make an impact, the one that Durban didn't make, and that we in fact will fight again racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, and anti-Semitism is on that list.
Amen. Amen. So with that, again, I want to say thank you. I want to wish everyone a Shana Tova and a Gamar Chatima Tova if you're celebrating Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. And hopefully we will be together in conversation again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.